Hey everyone, and thank you for joining me today in our episode of Caserta's Data Intelligence Webinar Series. I am your host, Remy Rosenbaum, and today we're going to discuss tips and tricks for data analytics leaders to forge a data-driven enterprise. So across every industry, businesses are mandating their organizations to be more data-driven. It almost seems like an overhyped buzzword by this point. However, by 2022, Gartner estimates that 90% of corporate strategies will explicitly mention information as a critical enterprise asset and analytics as an essential competency. So in this journey towards becoming an info-savvy organization, the role of the chief data officer has evolved from just mitigating risk to also creating business value with data assets. So the pressure is on, and as with any journey, the road to becoming a data-driven enterprise is fraught with twists and turns and obstacles that are going to undermine your success. I mean, for starters, most data analytics leaders don't assess the value of an organization's data because they lack ways to measure information as if it were a real-world business asset. We have a presenter who's going to tell you all about that. And data analytics leaders are hungry for an actionable data strategy roadmap to show them the way to successfully forge a data-driven enterprise. So to answer those two questions, we have together a dynamic data-driven Doug duo of presenters. So our first Doug is the father of infonomics and Caserta Principal Data and Analytics Strategy. He is a best-selling author and recognized authority on data and analytics. He advises senior IT, business and data leaders on data monetization and valuation, data management, governance, alternative data, analytics best practices, and information innovation. You're going to love his presentation. And afterwards, our second Doug is our Caserta Principal Data and Analytics Strategy and Architecture, Doug Gray. Mr. Gray has more than 30 years of experience as a data and analytics practitioner, software product and solutions delivery program manager, and CTO VP director with Fortune 500 companies, including American Airlines, Sabre, Travelocity, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Kansas City. Most recently, Doug was head of enterprise data and analytics technology for Southwest Airlines, where his teams won a total of 7 industry awards. Doug is also an adjunct professor of business analytics at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. So we have some great presentations coming up. And just a little bit of housekeeping, Caserta's complimentary data analytics expert webinar series is designed to give you insight into today's hottest technological trends and issues. After today's webinar, I encourage you to speak with us about any questions on how to apply what you've learned from either Doug today at your organization. Our initial consultations are always free. If we find the opportunity to work together, excellent, we can discuss next steps. And if not, we will gladly point you in the right direction. After the webinar, I'm going to send you a recording to the email address you provided. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, I encourage you to enter them in the questions panel on the right of the GoToWebinar control panel. And we will answer them at the end during our Q&A portion of the webinar. So, Mr. Laney, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Remy, and welcome everyone. One of the unique aspects to Caserta is that we don't subscribe to the tired meme that data or information is the new oil. Certainly, data does have value, and that value needs to be extracted and refined and used by CDOs and their organizations to fuel the organization. But the similarities really stop there. As we discussed on our last podcast, and as I detail in my Infonomics book, data has unique economic properties that make it ounce for ounce more valuable than oil. First, a drop of oil gets used up when you consume it. You can never use it again. Data has the amazing property that you can use it over and over, and it never gets used up or worn out. It's what economists would call a non-depleting asset. Second, you can use a drop of oil one way at a time only. Again, data has the unique property that you can use the same data for multiple purposes simultaneously. It's what economists call a non-rivalrous asset. And third, when you use a drop of oil, it doesn't create more oil, but using data typically creates more data, or at least the opportunity to collect more data about the business processes that are using it. In this way, data is what's called a regenerative asset. So there are other unique properties to information, including its relatively low storage or transportation or transmission costs compared to oil. And of course, as several unfortunate companies have found, that if you spill data, it's impossible to clean up. So now all that sounds somewhat obvious to you. Ask yourself the question, is my organization actually taking full advantage of these awesome properties of information? Do we actually architect solutions and systems to embrace these properties? And does our corporate strategy actually reflect these concepts? It's not likely so, at least in our experience. So helping organizations understand and take full advantage of the unique economic properties of information, or infonomics, is the foundation of our approach to data and analytics strategy. Generally, our approach begins with an assessment of available information assets, including determining their business and financial value. As I say, you can't manage well what you don't measure. And our research actually indicates that only 11% of organizations know the cost of their data. Only 12% have calculated any sort of financial value for at least some of their data assets. And only 21% of companies track how data quality improvements impact business process improvements. Yet organizations that measure their data, we find, are 5 times as likely to claim that they're generating significant business value from data. So then next, what we do is we use this economic understanding of your data to determine how and where to monetize it and manage it better, and manage it more as an actual asset rather than just occasionally a nice to have resource. And all this involves applying actual asset management principles and practices to information in ways that really have never been done before, yet have been done with other asset classes for years or decades or centuries. Yet, and then what we do is we architect and implement solutions from data warehouses and data lakes to enterprise data governance and data literacy programs to analytics and data science applications. So with that kind of overview, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Doug Gray, to share some of his deep insights and awesome experiences into the CDO role.
Thank you, Mr. Laney. Now we're going to move over to Caserta's Principal Data and Analytics Strategy and Architecture, Doug Gray.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's important that if you want to be a data leader or become a data leader, you have to look at some famous data leaders and some of their key characteristics and capabilities. And we're going to start our discussion today by doing just that. So with 400 million product SKUs and same day and next day data delivery, data and analytics is not optional at Amazon. In fact, it's an imperative. Amazon actually employs over 1,000 data scientists in their supply chain organization alone. And these data scientists have streamlined, automated, and optimized 100% of Amazon's merchandising, inventory management, warehousing, and delivery logistics operations. Suffice it to say, Jeff Bezos and his company have revolutionized retail in no small part using data and analytics. Harrah's Casinos was hurtling towards Chapter 11 bankruptcy when Gary Loveman arrived on the scene, first as Chief Operating Officer and then CEO. He literally saved Harrah's by introducing a new digitally based loyalty program that enabled all of his casinos to target their customers by gathering volumes of data about the games that gamblers play, how much they bet, and the comps that will entice them to come back to Harrah's properties. Loveman invested $100 million annually in IT data and analytics, and he revolutionized the modern gaming industry and returned Harrah's to profitability, again, in no small part with data and analytics. Our last famous data-driven leader was Bob Crandall, who was the CEO of American Airlines. And Bob was quoted as saying that his Sabre system and revenue management system was his most strategic weapon in the war of airline deregulation. And he invested hundreds of millions of dollars in creating this revenue management system that added $1 billion in top line revenue with the same fleet over a 2-year period. That technology is now utilized in hotels, cruise lines, passenger and cargo railroads, rental car companies, and even self-storage companies. Let's now look at a couple of the characteristics of these types of leaders and see how you can emulate them. So first of all, we all know that without facts that are based on data, all you really have are opinions. And in the corporate jungle today, the hippos often rule. And I don't mean hippopotamus, but hippo is actually an acronym for the highest paid person's opinion. The days of basing our decisions on experience and gut instinct alone are gone. And the CDO is now the leader of the vanguard of this new data-driven corporate culture. Figuring out how a business operates and makes money is critical, and that having that natural curiosity about your business to really understand the drivers of cost and revenue and customer satisfaction, and being willing to dig into the details through the lens of data and analytical models is key for CDOs. You don't necessarily have to be the smartest rocket scientist in the company building the most sophisticated models, but you do need to understand and appreciate what those people do and how they do it, and really know how to leverage those types of very specialized skills. Having built some of your own models along the way, financial models, marketing, or econometric models, is important to have that understanding of the model development process and how those models are deployed to production. There's a lot of talk now about combining chief data officer and chief analytic officer roles into one role, hence emphasizing analytics. Given the scale and the complexity of data in large enterprises, it's very easy to get tangled up in technology and boil the ocean type efforts, like master data management, for example. You really need to figure out what value you can deliver to the business, literally next week, next month, next quarter, and not next year. And strive towards working towards regular deliveries of value, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Timely progress is more important than big bang annual deliveries. Data and analytics really has to be a salient part of a company's strategy and day-to-day tactical operations. And that means that you as a CDO really need to understand the strategy and figure out how data and analytics can be used as levers, not only to adapt the company's strategy, but literally turn it and take it in a new direction as part of digital transformation. Partnering is key, and you really need to figure out and build the relationships with your business partners who are literally most adept and most aggressive at using data. Typically, marketing, finance, and supply chain leaders fall into that category. Technology is a huge enabler of data, and you have to have a trust-based, symbiotic relationship with the CIO and their organization. Otherwise, your efforts are going to be impeded on a practical basis. You know, data coupled with analytics is disruptive, and data will invalidate outdated, long-held assumptions that are frankly wrong. Data uncovers inconvenient truths, and it points out glaring inefficiencies and uncovers unforeseen opportunities. The CDO is the catalyst for change and transformation, but you need to do that in a politically astute way as to not upset the powers that be. And that's really key to illustrating how data benefits departments, divisions, product lines to improve performance. The most effective data-driven leaders are great storytellers. They grab the attention of decision makers by making bold statements that are backed up by facts based on data in terms and language that executives can understand. I like to start presentations with, what if I told you we could, for example, decrease our $6 billion raw materials bill by 1% with a $400,000 investment? Or if I could increase sales by 20% through customer segment targeting? These types of bold statements get the executive's attention and engage them in a dialogue about data. You need to be IT savvy because, frankly, you can't be daunted by technical complexity. Again, we're looking for people in the CDO role that are not necessarily the most technical person on your team, but you have to be able to ask the right questions and understand what technical staff are saying about technology, for example, platform choices, and make judgment calls and manage technical risk. Technology is a key enabler for data. Lastly, in our top 10, as a CDO, you will be responsible for delivering data solutions. There's a considerable complexity involving timelines, deliverables, milestones, and budgets. And delivery execution is key. Most IT projects fail to satisfy one or more of scope, timeline, and budget. And data and analytics projects are no different. And you want to avoid that fate as much as possible. So these are our top 10 successful CDO characteristics and capabilities. We've also seen that successful CDOs have particular mindsets. Most importantly, recognizing that data is a means to an end of generating business value. My favorite Stephen Covey habit is begin with the end in mind. You know, business value and economic impact is the ultimate objective of data, and it's very easy to get bogged down in the minutia and see data processes and technologies as ends in themselves. But they're really a means to an end. And you have to figure out what KPIs can be addressed and measured and improved with data. That's the North Star that you regularly need to ask yourself, what value am I delivering with data? There was a great article in Forbes in about a year ago that said that data analytics is no longer a nice option. It's the core of the enterprise. That's a really bold statement. But as the physical world becomes more digital, data is the new currency, as Doug Laney pointed out, and data and analytics are the new competitive differentiator. There's a temptation for some people to get enamored with process and technology, so much so that they lose sight of the end game. Data governance processes and data warehouse technology are necessary, but they're really means to an end of delivering value with data, and they shouldn't ever become the end in themselves. Business stakeholders only care about economic impact. And last but not least, people are really one of the most important aspects that have to be front of mind of a successful CDO. As with any major endeavor, you're going to need a wide range of skill sets, and we'll talk about those in a minute, to achieve this mission with data and analytics. And it's quite ambitious. Not everybody on your team, not everyone's going to be on your team. You're going to need to learn to work in matrices across business units, IT, third-party partners, and the CDO really functions as an orchestra conductor in this regard. Let's look at some common attributes of a common successful CDO profile. So Doug Laney and I have done a fair amount of research on this. We've run surveys, we've looked at LinkedIn, and we've looked at our own colleagues and our own network to look at what are some of the common attributes of successful CDOs in terms of building a profile. First of all, so the successful CDO characteristics and capabilities that we just outlined, that's really a key. So you can assume that we're going to have a large measure of those top 10. Oftentimes, companies are looking for an industry veteran. If you're working in a company or an industry like financial services or healthcare, there's quite a bit of detail, language, and domain knowledge that you need. However, some companies are also looking for a pivot from an adjacent industry, so moving from maybe healthcare insurance to healthcare delivery. Oftentimes, companies look to a company veteran, somebody that's been there, knows the inside of the culture, knows how to get things done, has good relationships. However, if a company can't find that ideal CDO candidate, it's not uncommon for them to go to a different industry and bring somebody in from the outside for a new hire, as a new hire. In terms of education, it's not necessarily true that you need a bachelor's degree in a hardcore engineering or computer science discipline. It's often true that we see a lot of CDOs that have degrees in economics or finance, which are quantitative, but not hardcore engineering. They often also times have an MBA. They have a very good understanding of how to work across the enterprise and how businesses really function in terms of finance, accounting, strategy, marketing. And since analytics and data are so closely tied to the business, it's very common to see this type of educational profile. Oftentimes we see high potential track leaders get moved into CDOs, no different than a CFO or a CMO. The CDO is really considered to be one of the most able executives in the C-suite because they need to have a deep and broad knowledge and understanding and command of the business strategy, tactics, and operations in order to leverage data throughout the business. And finally, we see that line of business leaders oftentimes emerge to take over the CD role. You might be in a functional area like marketing and finance that has a strong capability and characteristic for using data, and that often plays well into a CDO role. Alternatively, we do see some CDOs grow up through the technical ranks, either in technology or data analytics, or come from fields like operations research or statistics. So in all of these examples, we're looking for somebody with ideally 10 to 20 years of experience, whether you're in a particular industry or coming from a particular domain. With that, I believe Remy will take and hand it back to Doug.
All right, thanks. For for a long time, data leaders have referred to the concept of the information supply chain in describing the flow of data throughout the organization, but haven't really done a good job of articulating in many cases. Now, our preference is to refer to it as a value chain or even an information value network today because of the many complexities of an information ecosystem. But defining this chain or network involves starting with the goal in mind and then working backwards to source and manage data. So let's take a look at that. These are the three components of the value chain. It really starts with understanding how data is being applied. As Doug said, starting with that end in mind. So along this value chain, you'll see, and when we get into it, you'll see what we call information primitives, information asset primitives. These represent in English the things that we're doing with and to data along the way. You've seen complex architecture diagrams, and Doug Gray is going to show some of them in a moment and make some points. But you really want business people to understand the flow of information and its complexities and nuances. So a CDO or those on his or her team should perhaps use English to do so at first. Language matters, and we talk a lot about data literacy, so language is really important. So we've broken this down into these three main components. How are you acquiring data? How are you administering or managing data? And then how are you applying it? How is it driving business benefit? So this is a handy framework to use, and I'm sure there are similar ones that break them down in other ways. All right, so as I mentioned, there are these information asset primitives. So at the top here, starting with the end in mind, what are we trying to do? We're trying to generate some kind of measurable economic benefit, whatever that is, and Doug Gray will go into some examples here in a moment. But there are a variety of ways to generate that value when it comes to delivering information or deploying information. We can set up alerts, we can give access to it, we can generate reports, we can integrate data into backend systems, we can even monetize data directly or indirectly by selling it or trading it or lending it, as we talked about on the previous webinar. And so these are the ways, these are some, not necessarily a complete list, but some primitives you can use to describe how data is actually being applied. Then let's go to the other end of the spectrum and think about where that data is coming from. All right, what data do we need to deliver that benefit? And so we're thinking about how, what are the various alternatives for sourcing data both internally and externally? There's a wealth of external data assets, so it's not necessarily about what data we've generated or what data is in our own, in our own databases. There's a lot of valuable data out there. There are 5,000 data brokers. There's billions of social media posts. There is 10 million estimated open data sets published by government organizations. And then there's also internally dark data that you've forgotten about or archived. So there's a wealth of data that can be captured or generated or collected. And we need to think broadly about where that data is and how we're going to get it. And then then bringing it together is about how we're managing it. So these are the things that we're doing to improve data's potential, its potential to drive value, its potential to be delivered and deployed. And most of the information management supply chain activities you can see do really occur in this middle section. The more technical activities revolve around the physical representation and handling of data, like storing and indexing and encrypting and backing it up. But whereas the architecture related value-added activities include those to prepare information for consumption, these activities include those to increase its accessibility and its understandability, like metadata, or integrating it, or improving its reliability, or improving the overall quality of information. So of course, there's a lot of overlap between these levels, particularly among the acquisition and administration of data. So what I'm going to do is turn it back over to Doug Gray, and he's going to go through some examples of some real-world examples of how this framework can be applied by CDOs.
Okay, so I like to recommend to my teams and also clients that in order to avoid getting mired down in these boil the ocean, low value added data centric initiatives, I like to literally start on the right-hand side of this particular chart. And as Doug alluded to, talking about measurable economic goals. And every year we all go through this. Companies set their budgets, and there's always a directive that comes down that says something like, we're going to reduce cost of goods sold, raw material cost by 5%. And instead of moving from left to right and looking at all the different data sources that might be relevant and kind of getting lost in trying to create kind of abstract data architectures, my advice is to start with that goal and then work backwards to that left-hand side and identify that, the two main systems that are going to help us figure out where we are with COGS is SAP and Ariba. And there might be multiple tables and multiple columns within those data sets and those systems, but that really helps us to focus on key performance targets, key performance indicators, and then we move from right to left, and that helps us to focus on that business value that we're aiming at. Hold on one second. Oh. Sorry. Okay. So another example might be to increase plant throughput by 10% for one of our production plants. And again, that's a very discernible metric. It's got a target associated with it. It's very specific. Again, if we look back to the left and find out where the sources of that data are that we can source that data from, in this case, it's SAP, it's JDA, and perhaps it's an Oracle data store. Our last example is we'd like to offer targeted offers to our customer segments. And in order to do that, we really need a 360 customer view. In this case, we've got a lot of different systems that we would need to look at. We might need to look at Ariba for purchasing data, SAP for transaction history, Adobe Omniture to look at web behavior when customers are on our website shopping. What are they looking at? Where are they focusing their time and effort? And then finally, Salesforce, which would give us our master customer list that we can focus on. So again, when we're targeting business value and we're looking to focus our data efforts, instead of moving from left to right with boil the ocean kind of top down, looking at all of our maybe 400 applications or databases, let's start from the right and work back to the left. Let's start with the target and the business value goal, and then work back to where those data sources are located. Speaking of systems and source systems, let's take a look at some examples of architecting for data and analytics. So this is the standard Caserta corporate data pyramid. And if we work from the bottom up, we see a different view of the slides that I just showed you. So we look at source system data, which could be, as I've seen in my experience, big enterprises, Fortune 500 companies typically will have hundreds, in some cases thousands of applications and databases. And that's really where our source system data comes from. And in addition to that, we add on external data. It may be from companies like Experian or Axiom that are giving us customer data, or it may be supplier data or partner or sales partner data. We bring all that data into a landing area. That is our raw machine data collection, if you will. We bring all that data in full fidelity. That's our raw data. And then we start building a metadata capability to represent that raw data as well as securing it. Once we've got all that raw source data in, we can bring it up into a data lake. That's our integrated sandbox area. We can operate on that data. Now today we have SQL-like tools that provide SQL front ends for data lakes, so we can go in and explore that data. Many times that's where machine learning and data science applications come in, operating on that data lake. And the data lake is really the first level where we begin to organize and define and complete our data integration and start building a data catalog. And that's where we really start caring about data quality and monitoring on a structural level. As we move up one more level, we're at the data science workspace level. This could be what we call a sandbox. It's either in the cloud or perhaps it's on-prem in an area where data scientists can go in and explore data. They can look for patterns and trends. They can build predictive or prescriptive models to predict some outcome, for example, customer behavior to opt in for an offer. And then once those models are built, they can be transferred into a production application. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, we have our data warehouse. Now, data warehouse today, we've got lots of different options of different platforms. We have on-prem, we have cloud, public cloud, private cloud, but regardless, the data warehouse platform is still viewed as being complementary to data lake. Data lake doesn't replace a data warehouse or vice versa. This is where we have our most structured data. It's typically enabling ad hoc queries as well as structured reporting, and we can also use that data for modeling and analysis as well. This is a client sample reference architecture that Caserta has offered. So we see now a different view. We see our data sources on the left, systems like SAP and Salesforce, and that's a rather modest, very focused list of data sources. We're ingesting that data, we're pulling it into data lake environment. You see different tiers of the data lake there, and we're storing our data there. And this is an Amazon S3 simple storage service instance. From the data lake, we then ETL it out. We're putting that structured data into Snowflake, which is a cloud-enabled data warehouse, very scalable, very cost-effective. And then we're making that data available to a visualization layer where we can do business intelligence, data visualization, as well as predictive analytics. So these are custom. This is an example of a custom sample reference architecture that we've created. And as you're getting started as a chief data officer, you don't have to start from scratch. There are organizations like Gartner that provide these types of very robust kind of generalized reference architectures. They show the same activities: acquire, organize, analyze, and deliver, but they show them at a bit of a higher level. So you can actually get a feel for what are all the major salient components that my data and analytics reference architecture needs to include. If you make a decision to move to the cloud, there are 3 predominant cloud vendors out there today: Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. We tend to be agnostic about our cloud partners. We work with all 3 of those, but this is an example of a reference architecture for the cloud. This is where we can bring in both traditional transactional data as well as streaming data. And Amazon gives you a very nice set of tools to bring your data into a data lake and then a data warehouse platform, but also enables you to integrate third-party data warehousing platforms like Snowflake, for example. And then we have a full set of analytical tools that both Amazon provides, and they also enable third-party tools like Tableau, ClickView, et cetera, to be incorporated into the Amazon environment and ecosystem, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about organizing ourselves for analytics. There are 4 major groups of organizational skill sets within the data and analytics world. And if we go clockwise, first of all, domain knowledge. Any data endeavor will require a very tight integration and working relationship with people in the business. We need to have data analysts and data scientists on our side that sit down next to subject matter experts and domain knowledge experts in a particular area, like finance or marketing. We have to learn their language, we have to learn their acronyms, we have to learn about and understand their business processes. And most importantly, we need to figure out, how does that particular domain measure value? For marketing, it may be customer acquisition. For finance, it may be cost reduction. Regardless, we need to partner up with the business and embed our data specialists in the domain. Secondly, in the data space, this is really known as data engineering. These could be data modelers, data architects, data engineers that are good at setting up and populating data warehouses, data lakes, either in the cloud or on premise. We also call this data wrangling. It's just the idea of bringing data together from the myriad of different sources, internal and external to the company. This is a very specialized set of skills that we need to actually provide the data to operate. Technology plays a huge role in data and analytics. And whether we're talking about software, whether we're talking about cloud engineering, whether we're talking about DevOps and setting up a very highly automated, streamlined development, test, and production deployment pipeline, we're going to need technology experts. They may be Java developers, they may be cloud engineers that can deploy instances and set up environments, but there's quite a significant technology component that will either reside in the CDO's organization and or potentially sit in technology and be matrixed in. And last but not least, in terms of data scientists, there's some very advanced mathematical and statistical modeling skills that come in when we start talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive analytic models. These are typically highly educated, typically master's degrees or self-trained in programs like Coursera. And these are your heavy-duty rocket scientists. These are people that are building models and deploying those models to production to capture that business value. It's very rare to find one person with all 4 of those skill sets, and it's very rare, so we call those people at the intersection in the middle there unicorns. And you've seen all the memes on LinkedIn and on the internet now about the unicorn, but I always like to say that unicorns aren't born, but they can be made. In my experience, I've hired people that had maybe 1 or 2 of these skills, and then we work to develop their other skill set to complete that unicorn profiles. They embody each of these skill sets. Now, they're not going to be experts in each of those skill sets, but they need to have some level of sufficient capability in each of those. And lastly, if we just look at the difficulty level to acquire those skills, in my experience, it's relatively easy to pick up domain knowledge. If you make an intensive effort and you sit next to those folks and work with those folks in the business over a period of time, you can figure out how their world works. Data wrangling, it's low to medium complexity, and those skills can be acquired. Some level of programming skills, whether it's in SQL or a language like Python, is necessary. And then really the bottom half is where we start to get into the medium to high levels of difficulty. Software engineering, cloud engineering, and especially math and statistical modeling, those are very unique and kind of high bar skills that really require concerted effort, either through education, self-education, or over a period of time to acquire and develop those skills. So those are four sets of, or a set of four of our typical skill sets, and these will also be complemented by Scrum Masters and other types of skills that will support these, but these are the four main ones. So let's now transition and talk about planning for analytics. Doug asked me to give an example of a project execution delivery process that we used, and I've used this at all the major companies that I've worked for. We start there in the upper left-hand corner. We identify a particular business problem. The example that I'll look at here is for a major airline trying to figure out how to more effectively manage their multi-billion-dollar jet fuel portfolio. Within a period of 1 to 3 to 6 months, we stood up a sandbox. We built several different predictive models to forecast fuel demand in the future. We also built some optimizers to help us select vendors and satisfy our fuel demand at minimum cost, and then also manage our inventory on a monthly basis. Those models proved out to be very useful, and we selected the models. And then we went through our process we call a portfolio priority process. Many companies today are using SAFe, which is the scaled agile framework. So we prioritize those applications and those models, and that took about 1 to 3 months to get through an inception, where with Agile, you're going through and defining your stories and defining the capabilities that you want the solution to have. And then finally, after we'd gotten our final version of our models, which we implement those in terms of what's called a microservice down there in the left-hand corner of the slide. We're bringing in data from a wide variety of sources, like Ariba and SAP and our fuel management system. We had data that was in motion, data that was being collected from the field every day about the usage rates at different airports around the country. And then we had data that was at rest, data like pricing data that doesn't change very often. So we take our model, we incorporate it into our software application and incorporate it with a business logic layer and a GUI layer. And we were actually able to have a very significant economic impact and reduce that airline's fuel costs by about 1% per year, which is a significant number for a relatively small multi-$100,000 investment. And at that point, we're delivering that value back to our business domain subject matter cohorts, and we're solving that problem and enabling those decisions. It's been said recently that models make the enterprise smarter, but models embedded in systems really are what make the enterprise more economically efficient. And that's the goal. That's the end state that we're looking to achieve of that business value and that economic impact with data and analytical modeling. But this gives you an idea of a very common and very successful framework for delivery execution management. And those timeframes, 1 to 3 to 6 months, for example, for model development, that's really a function of the availability of our data. If we have our data at hand, we could do a model in an afternoon and build that set of models within a month. It may take us 3 months to get all the data that we need and clean it. And then that production release down in the left-hand corner, we're looking at average 3 to 6 months per minimum viable product release in an agile state. And again, that's highly dependent on where you are in that process. Maybe you could crank out releases in a couple of sprints, but initially early on to get that foundation and that entire production system built, it may very well be that type of a time frame. So hopefully this helps give an idea of delivery execution. I'm going to turn it back over to Doug to talk about how we avoid pitfalls.
All right. Thanks, Doug. Those are like some incredible insights. That was wonderful. Thank you. So the next thing I want to do is just to wrap up here, and then we'll take some questions. Is to share some of the kind of challenges or traps or pitfalls that we've seen some CDOs fall into. You know, the CDO role is relatively new, and a lot of CDOs, you know, don't necessarily have experience in that role. You know, not many people have experience in that role, and because it's somewhat new and it's still being defined. But in our observation, there are certain things that you might want to avoid. And we're also back from the recent MIT Chief Data Officer Summit that or symposium that I highly recommend attending each year. And these are also include some of the things that we heard from CDOs there as well. So I'll just run through them here quickly. There we go. The first is embarking on ethically dubious uses of data. Now, CDOs are not necessarily the digital ethicist of the organization, but they ought to have somebody at hand who is. Many organizations don't even have someone who is explicitly in charge of identifying ethical situations. And so we think it's really important. It's one of those new, fresh, hot roles that we talk about. So if the CDO doesn't have someone to turn to for this, then it's kind of a role that they have to take on their own. You know, we don't often know, as we're sharing data with others and as we're using data, what are the ways that it can be misused. And it's really important to think through what those are before actually deploying them. The next is not working hard enough on the CIO relationship. You know, for a lot of CIOs, the CDO role is a bit of an affront to their domain, their dominion, and relegates some of them to being really more or less chief technology officers, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a new business model that we recommend: a chief data officer and a chief technology officer, and perhaps not even a need for a CIO anymore. But regardless, it's really important for CDOs to work very hard on that CIO relationship, establish the boundaries between what constitutes data things that you're managing and technology things that the CIO is managing. There's a lot of overlap there that needs to really get sorted out. The next is getting too fixated on solving explicit business problems. Now, we talked a lot about starting with the end in mind, but that end in mind may also include innovation. You might not actually know how you're going to be innovating the business, especially when you're thinking about transforming aspects of the business or transforming entire business models, which data can do. One of those end goals in mind might be innovation in itself, and what form innovation actually takes once you get there, you may not be able to determine at the outset. So don't get too fixated on actual business problems that you can identify, but maybe some larger ones like transforming business models or innovating certain aspects of the business or products or services. The next is kind of a common one. I don't see a lot of organizations falling into this trap yet, but I do hear people still talking about the single source of single version of truth. They should say single version of truth. There really are multiple versions that are legitimate throughout the organization, and you really should focus more on creating a single source of truth, a place that people can go to for data that is blessed and maybe even valued, and includes metadata about its quality characteristics as well. The next is assigning data owners. Now, it's important to have somebody who is, as part of a data governance program, assigned responsibility and accountability for an information asset, but we don't like that word owner very much. It's one that sort of begets information hoarding and data silos. And when we looked around at other kinds of asset management principles and practices, the concept of a fiduciary or a trustee seem to strike the right chord. So rethink using that term owner and consider the concept of a trustee. A trustee is someone who has ethical and legal responsibility for the well-being or caretaking of a given asset, and it's a well-established role outside of the information domain that we think ought to be brought into the information domain. Next is only looking to your own industry for examples. We see too many companies asking us, what are others in our industry doing? And my flippant response to that often is, why do you want to be in second place? Why not look to what others in other industries are doing as great examples of how to monetize data or generate economic benefits from data in ways that your competitors haven't even conceived yet? Similarly, there's a fallacy or pitfall of only looking within your own organization for data. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of data outside from partners, suppliers, social media, open data, syndicated data, web content harvesting, and the companies that are doing really incredible things with their own data are munging it and mixing it and integrating it with data from external sources. So this takes somebody whose eyes and ears are open to external data, knows how to get access to it, knows how to integrate it, knows how to license it and coordinate it. So most companies have somebody who's in charge of procuring office supplies, but very few companies have anybody involved in procuring data supplies, and I think that's a real pitfall and should be part of the CDO's organization. Next is only looking for internal ways to generate data-driven benefits. And obviously it's great to start at home and find ways to use data to improve business processes, but there are a lot of external ways to drive value from data by monetizing it directly, selling it, licensing it to others, generating insights for others. Think about your entire business ecosystem and who else might value having their hands on or eyes on some of your data. Now, obviously, there are compliance issues there, and we've identified ways to deal with those that we can talk to you about. But we think it's a mistake to only be focusing on internal ways to drive value from data. And then there's the failure to measure information's quality and value. We talked about the importance of that you can't manage what you don't measure, and it really is important for CDOs to take on the responsibility of measuring information's quality and its potential and realize value. In fact, even having a conversation with the CFO to say, listen, I understand data is not a balance sheet asset, but we're in the midst of the information age here, and we're trying to become a more data-driven business. Shouldn't we be measuring our data as if it were a balance sheet asset, at least internally? Forget what the accountants say, but there's a reason to do so internally, and those conversations are usually really positive ones to have. And in fact, they're questions that the board is starting to ask. What is the value of our company's data, if only for M&A purposes? And then finally, a lot of the data strategy documents that we see really talk about managing data as an asset, but fall short of applying asset management principles and practices. Even things like inventorying what data you have, and then applying true asset management concepts is something that a lot of organizations just are not doing. So, it's been great to see organizations talking about data as an asset and managing it as an asset and treating it as an asset. It's really time to move beyond that and actually start managing it as an asset. So with that in mind, we're just going to wrap up and take some questions. So some of the key takeaways here are that we see successful data-driven leaders sharing these common characteristics and capabilities and mindsets that Doug talked about. There really are some commonalities, and also I guess the flip side is that there are common things that we see in organizations that are not successful with the CDO role, or CDOs themselves who are not successful. And everybody talks about people, process, and technology. You can't go to a conference today to hear folks talk about that triumvirate. But we think that adding data to that really completes the formula for creating business value. And data should be on that same level of an asset with process and technology. And obviously, people aren't actual assets because you can't own them, but they've been elevated to that level of an asset, at least conceptually, for several decades now. And then finally, that CDOs really need to be the catalyst for using data and analytics to drive business transformation, not just creating ever more pretty pie charts and bouncy bar charts and dashing dashboards, but really doing more with data, doing things that are more predictive and prescriptive and diagnostic, that are agents for change, not just agents for understanding the business.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentations. They were very good, and I hope that everyone has a lot of good takeaways from them. I'll now open up the Q&A. So if you look in the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see the questions panel on the right. So please enter them there, and then I can pass them along. So let's get started. Any tips on how to convert an experienced CFO who has mastered legacy models, but is skeptical about quantifying the value of data and treating data as an asset that is regularly measured?
Well, that's a great question, and it is a real chasm for an organization, let alone a CFO to cross. You know, most CFOs have been really trained in what constitutes an asset, and those asset classes were defined by the nascent, you know, SEC, the Securities Exchange, back in the 1930s, and hasn't changed. And so I just don't know that we need to rely on the accountants to make that change, and maybe it'll come in 5 to 10 years. But you know, there's no argument that information meets the criteria of an asset. It's something that's owned and controlled, it's exchangeable for cash, and it generates probable future economic benefits that flow to the organization that controls it. And so that's the definition of an asset. And so irrespective of what the accountants say, I just think in today's age, it's ridiculous, if not downright irresponsible, for an organization to not have some measure of the value of its information, at least a cost basis, and ideally a way to measure the information's contribution to revenue streams or expense savings, or information's contribution to improvements in business process performance vis-a-vis KPIs. So there are a variety of ways that we've defined, we've created on how to measure information's value that we think really can and should be used by an organization. But I think to not do so at any level is just downright irresponsible today.
Okay, here's another one. Can you help organizations set up an office of the CDO, and what would this process look like? Doug, would you like to take that one? Doug Laney?
Yeah, I'll just hit the high levels on this, and I think Doug Gray will have some things to add. But you know, I think you know, when we're setting up an office, obviously it's something that needs to be proven, right, or demonstrated to have value, and it's a high level. You know, introducing a new high-level executive is difficult for organizations. So one of those things is to make that case that data is a business asset, make sure everybody appreciates that and agrees with that, and then define that role of the CDO office as one that is going to be involved in or responsible for measuring information's value, for monetizing it, for generating economic benefits from it, and managing it as an actual asset. And again, some of those responsibilities will be ones that are perhaps stripped from other executives like the CTO or the CIO. So that needs to be dealt with. You'll need to identify who the stakeholders are, what your objectives for the role are, and they differ. Some organizations want a real chief CDO, right? A real executive. Others want a CDO, kind of a name only. That's somebody who is more consultative to the organization, but doesn't really have the level of executive responsibility or a seat at the table like other executives do. So you'll want to define what those assumptions are, what the deliverables are, how that role is being measured, what are the relevant research and best practices and pitfalls and experiences. What's your timeline for setting up that role, and your timeline for things like building the foundation, the data foundation, and at the same time achieving some quick wins, quick significant wins with using data. What does that whole organization of the CDO look like? Not just the role itself, but what does that CDO's organization look like? Are they taking on some people from the traditional IT organization? Are you really bifurcating the IT organization, or again, is it more consultative? And what does kind of that joint leadership role look like as well? There's a lot of other things that we do, but that kind of hits the high level. I don't know if Doug, you have anything else to add there.
That was a good summary, Doug. I think, Remy, if you have another question.
Sure. So here we go. Would you say that there's a critical gap between executives that are not analytically literate enough to set a realistic vision and command, and practitioners who largely fail to think strategically or lead with business benefit? The two roles seem to speak very different languages, and there are few translators available. What is your experience? Great question.
That's a really deep question. Yeah.
I can take a shot at that one. So data literacy is a very hot topic right now. Doug and I were just talking about this the other day, and data literacy, if it's not already there, it's already there for a lot of executives like CFOs, chief marketing officers, or in my experience, two of the more data literate executives. I had a CMO stand up, chief marketing officer, stand up at a TED Talk, and his first line was, "Marketing is data, and everything we do depends on data." So that guy is very marketing literate. And I think that you have to raise and work very hard to raise the level of data literacy among executives so that we're all on at least some reasonable same footing. But that implies that the executive wants to achieve that level of data literacy. If they're going to dig their heels in and be stubborn about it, I mean, you'll only get so far. So my advice is to work with the executives that are data literate already, prove some success, and then it's easier to get some of these other folks, the HIPPOs, the highest paid person's opinion folks, on board, because nothing sells like success.
Right.
And they'll see their peers doing it, and then they'll feel like, well, man, I better get on board with this data stuff. I've got to raise my level of literacy. And then in terms of data science and those folks being more literate in terms of being able to talk in terms of business, Doug and I both teach at the graduate level, and in my class, I have my students get up and do a TED Talk to present their project to me as if I was their CEO or their COO. I think it's really important for data scientists to have every opportunity and take every opportunity to learn good communication skills. And I'm not just talking about Toastmasters and making, quippy speeches. I'm talking about explaining what they did in terms that are meaningful and understandable to executives so we can convey the business value. Leave all the formulas and the Greek letters for the appendix unless they ask, which most executives won't do. But that's how we work on closing the gap. The people at the data scientist level have to come up to meet the executives on their terms and with their language and their terminology and their things that they care about, their metrics. And frankly, all executives have to reach some minimal level of data literacy if this is ever going to work and you're really going to get the flywheel going of the impact of data, in my opinion.
Excellent answer. All right, we have time for just one more question. Any other questions you guys will have, you can please email me after the webinar and I will return to you an answer. So here's the final question. Do you find data hoarding and siloing common in large organizations? And can you help with that through technology and organizational culture?
Oh my goodness. Let me just share a little data, and Doug, you may have a quick thought on that. We looked at companies that have CDOs, and what we found is that companies that have CDOs are more likely to where's my data here? More likely to share data throughout the organization. Yeah, here it is. Organizations with chief data officers are 3 times more likely to have cultures that share data freely throughout the organization than organizations that don't. So there's something either about those kinds of organizations that bring on a CDO, or some things that CDOs have done to change that culture to really free up data throughout the company and dispense with that notion of data hoarding and ownership.
All right.
Yeah, it's a chronic problem. It happens a lot of different places, and the only way to get past it is when the organization as a whole sees that information as power, not just for a given department or a user group. Information has got to be power for the entire enterprise to achieve a competitive advantage and get that business value. Otherwise, you'll never get people to give up their silos. It's chronic, and we need to address it.
And back to the propensity, we found that only 30% of organizations is data considered an enterprise asset, and in 40% organizations report that it's hoarded or shared begrudgingly.
All right, and that's all the time we have for today.
Yeah.
Thank you to our excellent presenters, Doug and Doug, and thank you to our audience. I will be processing and sending out the recording of the webinar, and please reply with any questions on how we can help you in your organization to make you more of a data-driven enterprise. Thank you, everyone.